He never signed another personal check after 1907. I have spent 30 years reading the ledgers of dead millionaires, and that one detail stopped me cold. John Pierpont Morgan, the man who once loaned the United States Treasury enough gold to keep the country solvent, stopped putting his own name on his own money, not out of fear, out of design. The autumn the banks nearly died, he sat in his library on the corner of 36th Street and Madison Avenue, a room lined with rare manuscripts, and he made the markets behave by sheer will. Then, when the smoke cleared, he rebuilt the way he held everything, quietly, permanently. I am not your accountant, and this is not advice for your taxes. I am telling you what the records show. There is a structure underneath the Morgan name that most people were never told to look for. Stay with me, because the trick is not where you think it is. The panic of 1907 did not arrive with a warning. It arrived the way most financial collapses do, which is to say slowly and then all at once. A failed attempt to corner the copper market in October set off a run on a chain of banks and trust companies in New York. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest in the city, so suspended payments on the 22nd of October. Depositors lined the sidewalks. By the next morning, the panic had spread to the Trust Company of America, and the whole system of credit that the country ran on began to seize up like an engine with no oil. Understand what a run actually looked like in those days. There was no insurance on your deposit. If you stood in line and the cash ran out before you reached the window, your savings were simply gone. So everyone ran at once, which is exactly what guarantees the cash runs out. A healthy bank and a sick bank looked identical from the sidewalk, and fear did not bother to tell them apart. The trust companies, which had grown fast and held thinner reserves than the old national banks, were the first to crack. There was no Federal Reserve then. There was no central bank to step in and flood the system with cash. There was instead one man, the Treasury Secretary at the time, George Cortelyou, came up from Washington with government deposits. But everyone in the room understood whose room it was. The financiers of New York gathered. More than once in the private library Morgan had built beside his house, and he kept them there until they agreed to pool their own money to save the institutions that could be saved, and to let the ones that could not be saved fall in an orderly way. He was 70 years old. He had a cold. He sat in a chair with a cigar and a hand of solitaire and decided which banks lived and which died. On one of the worst nights, the story goes, he locked the doors of the library and would not let the bankers leave until they had signed their commitments. The older men dozing in the leather chairs while the younger ones argued figures by lamplight. By the time the sun came up, the money had been promised, and the run began to ease. When it was over, the United States Congress took a hard look at the fact that the nation's financial survival had depended on the judgment of a single private citizen. That discomfort is part of what produced the Federal Reserve a few years later. But the part of the story that interests me is what happened to Morgan himself. Because here is the thing about a man who can save a nation. He is also a man who can be sued by it. He is a man whose personal name is attached to a fortune, and a personal name can be reached by creditors, by courts, by the tax collectors who arrive the day after the funeral. The very visibility that made Morgan powerful in 1907 made him exposed. His firm, J.P. Morgan and Company, was not just a bank, it was the entity. It was the thing that held the stakes, sat on the boards, controlled the railroads and the steel and the shipping lines. Morgan, the man, directed it. But increasingly, Morgan, the man, did not personally own the pile. That distinction is the antagonist of this entire story, and it has two faces. The first face is personal liability. When you own a thing in your own name, every lawsuit against that thing is a lawsuit against you, your house, your savings, your family's security. The second face is estate exposure. When you die owning things in your own name, those things are counted, valued, taxed, and fought over in open probate court for anyone to read. A holding entity removes both faces at once. And Morgan, who had just watched the whole country's wealth depend on one fragile human being, understood exactly how fragile a name on a deed really is. He had spent a career assembling other people's broken companies into one strong structure. It would have been strange if he had not at last done the same thing with himself. Let me name the thing plainly, because the whole trick lives in one idea. A holding company is an entity that owns assets so that a person does not have to. You create a company. The company does not make a product or sell a service. Its only job is to hold things. Shares of other companies, real estate, patents, cash. The person at the top does not own those assets directly. The person owns or controls the holding company, and the holding company owns the assets. Read that again because the contrast is the entire point. The ordinary way to be rich is to own your wealth. The Morgan way to be rich is to control the entity that owns your wealth, while you, personally on paper, own very little. Think of it like the difference between holding a deed in your pocket and holding the key to a vault that holds the deed. If someone takes your pocket, they get the deed. If someone wants the vault, they have to get past the vault. And the vault was built by lawyers to be very hard to get past. The man with the deed in his pocket is rich and exposed. The man with the key is rich and protected. From the outside, they can look like the very same man. Let me walk the mechanism step by step the way it actually works. Step one, you form a company. In Morgan's era, this was a corporation or a partnership. Today, for most people, it is a limited liability company. The entity is registered with a state. It has its own name, its own tax identity, its own legal existence separate from you. From the day it is filed, the law treats it as a separate person. And that separateness is the whole point. Step two, you move assets into that entity. Instead of buying a building in your own name, the building is bought by the company. Instead of holding shares of a railroad personally, the shares are held by the holding company. The title, the deed, the registration all read the company's name, not yours. The asset is exactly the same. The line on the paperwork is the only thing that changed, and that one line is worth everything. Step three, you control the entity without personally owning the assets inside it. You are the manager, or you hold the controlling interest, or you sit at the top of a chain of entities. You make every decision. You direct every dollar, but your personal name is not on the property. This is the heart of it. Control and ownership, which most people think are the same thing, have been quietly pulled apart. Step four, when a problem comes for an asset, the problem stops at the wall of the entity. A lawsuit against the building sues the company that owns the building. The company can lose that building, but the loss does not reach across into your house and your personal savings because those are held somewhere else by something else. The fire stays in one room because someone built a wall there long before the fire started. Now, the legal part, and I want to be careful and accurate here. This is not a loophole someone discovered. This is the foundation of corporate law itself. The idea that a corporation is a separate legal person, distinct from its owners, was settled in American and in English law in the 19th century. The famous principle that an owner is not personally liable for the company yes has been a cornerstone of business law for well over 100 years. Holding companies grew directly out of that principle. When New Jersey changed its laws in 1888 and 1889 to let one corporation own the stock of another, it opened the door to exactly the structure Morgan and his peers used to build the great trusts. So the structure is real, it is old, and it is legal. The richest families did not break the rules. They simply read the rules more carefully than everyone else, and they built their lives inside the protections the law already offered. There was never a secret meeting. There was never a hidden law. The protection was sitting in the open statute books the whole time. And the difference between the families who used it and the families who did not was simply that some of them bothered to ask good lawyer the right question. But here is the catch, and the catch is the part the brochures never mention. A holding company protects you only if you respect the wall. If you treat the company's bank account like your personal wallet, if you mix the money, if you sign personal guarantees, if you ignore the formalities, a court can do something called piercing the veil. It can decide the separation was a fiction and reach right through to you. The protection is only as strong as the discipline behind it. A wall you keep punching holes in is not a wall. Which brings me back to the personal checks, and I will come back to that because it matters more than it looks. By his death in 1913, Morgan controlled an empire that is genuinely hard to describe in a single number. Through his bank and his partnerships, he sat at the center of railroads, the largest steel company on earth, shipping lines, electrical manufacturing, and dozens of banks. He had assembled United States Steel in 1901, the first company in history valued at more than $1 billion, at a time when $1 billion was a fraction of the entire national economy. He had reorganized so many failing railroads into working systems that the practice earned its own name in the press, and his fingerprints were on the boards of companies across the whole industrial map of the country. And yet, when the man died in Rome in the spring of 1913, and his estate was finally totaled and read into the record, the figure that came back was something close to $80 million, with the art collection counted as a large piece of that. A great deal of that number was not factories or railroads at all. It was paintings, manuscripts, and antiquities, the things a man buys for himself because he loves them, the things that genuinely were his and no one else's. $80 million in 1913 was an immense personal fortune, more than almost anyone alive could imagine. But set it against what he controlled, and it is a sliver. He directed the flow of perhaps a quarter of the country's industrial capital. His personal estate was a rounding error against the empire that answered to him. That gap is not an accident. That gap is the holding company at work. The assets were held by the bank, by the partnerships, by the trusts, by the entities. Morgan the man directed them. But Morgan the man did not personally own most of them, so they did not pass through his personal estate, and they were not all taxed and probated as if they were his alone. The empire kept running the morning after the funeral exactly as it had run the morning before, because the empire had never lived inside the man. There is a line that has followed this story for 100 years. When John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in America, heard the size of Morgan's estate, he is supposed to have said with real surprise, and to think he wasn't even a rich man. Whether or not those were the exact words, the meaning is exactly right, and it is the most important sentence in this entire video. Rockefeller was not joking. By the standard of what these men controlled, 80 million in your own name was small. The truly wealthy did not keep their wealth in their own name at all. They kept it in structures. Rockefeller's own fortune was wrapped inside the Standard Oil holding structure. The very same idea, only larger. The two men were rivals in almost everything, but on this one principle, they agreed completely, and they had each arrived at it on their own. So now the personal checks make sense. A check is your name on your money, leaving your personal account in public, on the record. A man who has learned to hold everything inside entities has very little flowing through a personal account to write checks against. The bank pays, the trust pays, the entity pays. The man on paper is almost a guest at his own fortune. That is not poverty. That is the deepest kind of control, the kind that owns nothing and commands everything. Now let me turn the camera around and point it at the rest of us, because this is where it gets personal. Most people, including most successful people, own everything in their own name. The house, the car, the savings, the rental property, the small business, all of it sitting under one name, which is your name. It feels natural. It feels honest. And it is, in terms of risk, the most exposed way a person can possibly hold wealth. You spend 40 years building it, and you hold all of it the way a child holds a fistful of marbles, all in one open hand. Here is why it fails, and it fails in three ways. First, liability. When everything is in your name, a single lawsuit can reach all of it. A car accident, a tenant who slips on a step, a business deal that sours, a contractor who sues. The claim does not politely stay with the one asset that caused it. It comes for the whole pile, because the whole pile is you. One bad afternoon can put your home, your savings, and your retirement on the same chopping block. The thing that caused the trouble might be worth a few $1,000s, and yet everything you own is standing behind it. Second, probate. When you die owning things in your own name, those things do not pass quietly to your family. They pass through probate, the court process that validates a will and settles an estate. Probate is public, which means strangers can read what you owned. It is slow, often taking months and sometimes years. And it can be expensive, with court costs and fees that eat into what you meant to leave behind. The family waits, the assets freeze, and the lawyer's bill, all at the worst possible moment when the people you love are already grieving. Third, lawsuits and the sheer fragility of a single name. The wealthy figured out a century ago that a name is a target and an entity is a shield. The ordinary saver, holding everything personally, has painted that target on every single thing they own, all at once, with no wall anywhere between the asset and the disaster. That is the trap Morgan stepped out of in 1907. Most people never even learn that the door exists. So, how does a regular person actually use this? And I have to say this clearly the way the records force me to say it. I am a historian. I am not your attorney, and I am not your tax advisor. Nothing here is personalized advice for your situation. What I can do is describe the structure honestly and tell you who to ask. The everyday version of the Morgan structure is the limited liability company, the LLC, used as a holding company. The idea is the same one the Gilded Age financiers used, scaled down to a normal life. You can form an LLC to hold a rental property so that a tenant's lawsuit reaches the property's entity and not your home. A business owner can separate the operating business from the real estate and the equipment so that a failure or a claim in one part does not automatically swallow the others. This is called asset separation, and it is the heart of the whole tradition. The principle is plain. Do not let one lawsuit reach everything. Put walls between your assets so that a problem with one is contained and does not flow into the rest. That is what the holding company does. It builds walls. The same idea that protected the richest man in America can protect a retired couple with a single rental unit because the law does not check your net worth at the door. Now, the honest part about cost and limits. Forming an LLC is not free, and it is not a magic word you say once. There are filing fees that vary by state, often somewhere from 50 to a few $100s to set up, plus annual fees and sometimes annual reports. There is bookkeeping because the entity must keep its money separate from yours, or you lose the protection. And the structure has to be set up correctly for your situation, which is exactly why you bring in a professional. So here is the real instruction, the only one I will give. Sit down with an estate planning attorney and a tax professional by their proper titles, an attorney licensed in your state, and a certified accountant, and ask them one specific question. Ask whether a holding structure makes sense for what you own. They will tell you. They will know the rules of your state, the cost against the benefit, and whether your situation even calls for it. For many people with simple finances, it does not. And an honest attorney will say so rather than sell you something you do not need. For someone with a business, property, and a family to protect, it can be the difference between a wall and a wide open field. Pay for the hour of their time. It is the cheapest part of the whole thing. Let me bring this home because the lesson is older than Morgan and it will outlast all of us. The men who built the great American fortunes did not get rich by keeping more in their own pockets. They got rich, and they stayed rich across generations by changing the relationship between themselves and their wealth. They stopped owning things and started controlling them. They built entities, and they lived inside the protection of those entities. And when they died, the empire did not die with them because the empire was never in their personal name to begin with. JP. Morgan stopped writing personal checks after 1907, not because he had less money, but because he had finally arranged his money so that almost none of it flowed through him personally. He had become the key to the vault instead of the deed in the pocket. That is the whole secret, and Wall Street has been using it without interruption ever since. You do not need a panic and a private library to learn the lesson. You need to understand that ownership and control are not the same thing, that a name is exposed and a structure is protected, and that the law has offered this protection to everyone for over 100 years, even while almost no one is ever told to use it. If this opened a door you did not know was there, subscribe and stay with me because we are walking through the structures of the richest families one at a time. Next time, I want to show you the family that took this further than Morgan ever did. The DuPonts kept a single fortune intact and growing for more than 200 years through one of the first true family offices in America, a private machine built for one purpose, to make sure the wealth never had to start over. That story is coming next. I will see you there.